and good afternoon to everyone. I am Dr. Monica Brown. I serve as the Senior Vice President for Student Affairs at Montgomery College, and I'm also the current chair of the Maryland Chief Student Affairs Officers Affinity Group. I am confident that you have enjoyed and significantly benefited from your experience with the summit thus far, but just hold on and tighten your belt because it's about to get even better. I have the esteemed pleasure of introducing our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Glaude Jr. One of the nation's most prominent scholars, Dr. Glaude Jr. is a New York Times bestselling author and chair of Princeton's Department of African American Studies. In addition to being an author, he is a political commentator, public intellectual, and passionate educator who examines the complex dynamics of the American experience. His writings, including Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, also In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, and his most recent, the New York Times bestseller, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, takes a comprehensive look at Black communities, the difficulties of race in the United States, and the challenges we face as a democracy. Dr. Glaude Jr. is the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor and was awarded the Modern Language Association's William Sanders Scarborough Book Prize. He frequently appears in the media as a columnist for Time Magazine and an MSNBC contributor on programs like Morning Joe and Deadline White House with Nicole Wallace. He regularly appears on Meet the Press on Sundays. Dr. Glaude Jr. also hosts Princeton's AAS podcast, a conversation around the field of African American studies and the Black experience in the 21st century. He is often described as the quintessential Morehouse man, having left his home in Moss Point, Mississippi at age 16 to begin studies at the HBCU. He holds a master's degree in African American Studies from Temple University and a PhD in religion from Princeton University. There's so much more that I could share about Dr. Glaude Jr., but time does not permit me to do so. Therefore, I encourage you to take time to read his bio in its entirety. Without further ado, I welcome and introduce to you Dr. Glaude Jr. And I'll ask you to unmute yourself for just a moment and give him a huge Maryland round of applause and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that gracious introduction, Dr. Brown. Thank you, Dr. Travis, for your leadership. I want to thank Brother Wallace and Brother Rice for all the work that you've been doing. I take it to make this event happen. I want to thank all the people behind the scenes, that invisible labor that makes these sorts of events, whether in person or online, that makes it possible. So we want to thank all the folks who are working behind the scenes. So to make this moment right now, right here possible. I want to begin with one of the founders of critical race theory, Derek Bell. In his last book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, Bell offered what some consider to be a rather pessimistic account of Black life in the United States. He maintained that much of American history revealed not so much that the country was on the road to a more perfect union, but rather that racism had to be seen and understood as a constitutive feature of American life. He wanted us to recalibrate our approach, to struggle for something other than an America without racism. Bell had concluded that the country was irredeemably racist. For him, and he's quoting the Harvard scholar Judith Hochschild here, the continued viability of racism demonstrates that, quote, racism is not simply an excrescence on a fundamentally healthy liberal democratic body, but is part of what shapes and energizes the body. Under this view, liberal democracy and racism in the United States are historically, even inherently reinforcing. American society, as we know it, exists only because of its foundation in racially based slavery. And it thrives, according to Hochschild and Bell, only because racial discrimination continues. The apparent anomaly is actually symbiosis, end quote. For Bell, racism is as American as apple pie. And that fact was not going to change. At least this is what he was writing in The Faces at the Bottom of the Well. Now, this is a conclusion drawn from a life of struggle. He urged us, along with Richard Delgado and Kimberly Crenshaw and others, the kind of founding voices of critical race theory, to understand the law as a complicated tool to remedy racism in the country. In some ways, critical race theory emerges out of or as a response to the Bakke decision, right? And trying to get people to understand that if law was in fact going to be a tool to remedy racial discrimination, we would have to understand it within a broader context. Critical theory insists that we understand the law, and its role, its place in the reproduction of a particular racial regime. And that if we are to generate substantive remedies to racism in our lives, we would have to situate the law within broader historical, social, and political context. We would have to understand its place and function in the reproduction of racial hierarchies. The law is not just simply a remedy for racial discrimination. The law actually plays a role in reproducing it. So understood, the law could still be used as a means to remedy racism in the country. But near the end of his life, after resigning from Harvard Law School, Derek Bell came to the conclusion that, quote, despite what we designate as progress wrought through struggle over many generations, we remain what we were in the beginning. A dark and foreign presence, always the designated other, tolerated in good times, despised when things go wrong. As a people, we are scapegoated and sacrificed as distraction or catalyst for compromise to facilitate resolution of political differences or relieve economic diversity, to relieve economic diversity. This was 1992. And now critical race theory is this kind of broad label to capture all the things about race and racial diversity that we want to disagree with, that some Americans want to disagree with. In the end, Derek Bell concluded, Black people, quote, will never gain full equality in this country. Even those Herculean efforts we hail as successful will produce no more than temporary peaks of progress, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. This is hard to accept. This is hard to accept this fact that all history verifies. We, he says, must acknowledge it, not as a sign of submission, but as an act of ultimate defiance. Not as a sign of submission, but as an act of ultimate defiance. Now, this is a bleak picture, indeed. And in some ways, given the assaults on voting rights, given the insurrection of January 6th, given the attack on critical race theory, saying that people are teaching critical race theory in kindergarten. That makes no damn sense, right? It's a bleak picture, but it sounds familiar, at least to me. One hears the echoes of W.E.B. Du Bois, who left the country, dying in Ghana, and on the eve of the March on Washington, cautioning us, right, to not get our hopes too high. Or one hears it in the words of Baby Suggs to Denver and Toni Morrison's Beloved, as Baby Suggs recounts the horrors of slavery, but she tells her baby to know it, but gone out the yard. What is the it here in Morrison's novel? That the country can dirty you so bad, that white people can dirty you so bad on the inside that you don't like yourself anymore. At the end of his life, Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, like so many others, wanted us to accept the truth of this place, but to keep fighting anyway. Fascinating. Now, one doesn't have to agree with the conclusion of Derek Bell to understand his argument. He wanted us, you and me, to fight on a different battlefield, to recalibrate our aims and ends of, quote, moving beyond the comforting belief that time and the generosity of its people will eventually solve America's racial problem, end quote. Now, I still believe, contra Derek Bell, that this nation can be otherwise, that a new Jerusalem is possible. I still believe that. But we have to understand that something radical must happen, particularly within ourselves. We have to shake loose the comforting fantasies and imagine ourselves in different terms. Critical race theory, thank you. Critical race theory demands an honest confrontation with the practices and structures that reproduce white supremacy in this country. It also insists on an honest confrontation with ourselves. Now, what might that look like for male students of color, Sister Heather Grease, right? At a place like Montgomery College. I want to begin with a story, not so much because I'm a storyteller, although there are times where I aspire to be, but because it is illustrative of what I want to say to you today, and of what I take to be a kind of wisdom that not only allows us to endure this madness that is America today, but also to flourish. Oftentimes we find ourselves talking about how do we ensure the success of a particular demographic, namely male students of color. But there's a difference in my mind between flourishing and succeeding. There's a difference between flourishing and succeeding. Success, to my mind, relies on an external measure. What it means to be a successful athlete can be determined by one stats line, or what level you are playing the game. Or to be a successful scholar can be measured by the number of books one publishes or receiving tenure, right? Or to be a successful student can be measured by your grades or your ranking in graduation and the like. But flourishing, it seems to me, is a bit different. And Bell wants us to grapple with this question in light of the constraints of a society committed to white supremacy. Of course, flourishing can be read as a synonym of success, but it also refers to something internal, what the Oxford Dictionary defines as to grow well, to be healthy, to be happy. Happiness sounds a bit too much like American drivel, but I am certainly interested in what are the conditions necessary for our students, especially men of color, to flourish in the classroom, to flourish generally. And that entails something in addition to excelling in courses and the like. And I say this as a professor for close to 30 years now, where I have witnessed up close students who are succeeding, but who are not flourishing. Students who are making the grades, but who feel broken, witnessing the erosion of self-trust, too concerned about what others around them are thinking and saying. They experience what the historian Nell Painter calls soul murder. I hope I'm not too boring, Sister Heather. Now, I want to get back to my story. In 1963, students at Howard University, more specifically, members of NAG, the Nonviolent Action Group, who helped organize in Cambridge, Maryland, with Gloria Richardson, you know, the late, great Gloria Richardson, and many who would become members or leaders of SNCC. NAG invited a group that included James Baldwin to campus. It was part of a series of programs they sponsored called Project Awareness, which was designed to explore the full complexity and richness of Black life and to engage the controversies surrounding the Black freedom movement. Baldwin spoke at the event alongside Ossie Davis and John O. Killings. Malcolm X even snuck in the audience that evening to hear Baldwin speak. As he put it, whenever, quote, I hear this little brother is going to speak in any town where I am, I always make a point of going to listen because I learned something, end quote. During the discussion, Baldwin made a point that I live by, quote, we must tell the truth till we can no longer bear it, end quote. But that is not the story. After the symposium, Baldwin retreated to an apartment of one of the NAG students, and there they discussed a wide range of issues until the sun came up. Stokely Carmichael, who would later become Kwame Ture, described the night in his autobiography, quote, our older brothers reasoned with us like family. We had 3 years behind us. The national mood was sore, tense, and uncertain, as was our mood, end quote. These students were on the front lines of the movement. They were risking everything, including their lives, to transform the nation. And what they were now confronting was the undeniable fact the country had refused to fundamentally change. Everyone understood the burden of the students, the burden the students carried on their shoulders. They had already confronted the brutality of Southern sheriffs. Many had been beaten and chased down dusty roads in Mississippi and Alabama by the Klan. Pessimism and rage threatened to overwhelm them, the kind of pessimism that would grab hold of Derrick Bell in his later years. Baldwin worried about the young men and women like any older brother would. As the meeting wound down, he was left to say the final words, and those words are particularly relevant, I think, to today, to you, to this moment. Quote, well, here we are, my young brothers and sisters. Here's how matters stand. I, Jimmy Baldwin, as a Black writer, must in some ways represent you. Now, you didn't elect me and I didn't ask for it, but here we are. All eyes were fixed on him. Everything I write, he said, will somehow reflect on you. So what do we do? I'll make you a pledge. If you promise your elder brother that you will never, ever accept any of the many derogatory, degrading, and reductive definitions that this society has ready for you, then I, Jimmy Baldwin, promise you I shall never betray you. It was an avowal of love and a declaration of his responsibility as a writer dedicated to speaking the truth. Now, what's important about this story, beyond the obvious power of Baldwin's witness, is his insistence to the students not to believe what this place says about them. And that advice remains relevant in our crazy, maddening world. You right now have to navigate and negotiate a wide range of assumptions about your capacities and your talents. And you right now have to develop the armor to protect yourselves from the ongoing assault on your personality, on your very being. And this has been your and my lot since the day we took our first breath, and for no other reason than because some among us believe that white people ought to be valued more than others in this country. And they've organized the world to reflect that fact. A world in which advantage and disadvantage are distributed along the lines of that fact. If you are to flourish, not only in the classroom, but in this country, you must not believe the derogatory and degrading and reductive assumptions that all too often shape the perception of you. You must make that promise to yourselves. You must know it, but going out the yard. What is the it that the world can dirty you so bad on the inside that you might not like yourself, but you still have to muster up the courage and step off the floor, step off the porch, into the world, as it were. I'm reminded of an essay by Jimmy Baldwin entitled "My Dungeon Shook," a letter to my nephew on the 100th anniversary of the emancipation in the fire next time. What he said to the Howard students can be heard as a distillation of what he tells his nephew. He offers a kind of wisdom born out of hard living. He doesn't want his nephew to suffer the fate of his grandfather, to believe what the world said about him. He describes America as it is, without the myths and legends that protect its innocence. The occasion for this advice, for my words to you today, is that we live in a country that has carried its sins forward. A country that refuses to give up this idea that some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. And they have built a world to reflect that belief. But Baldwin tells his nephew to trust his experience, to trust himself. And this self-trust is absolutely essential to your survival. Oftentimes we are socialized to quiet ourselves. Socialized as a condition for our entree to mute who we take ourselves to be. We quiet our voices so that people aren't uncomfortable around us. We accept what people say about who we are. And then we begin to believe that we lack capacity, that we lack talent, that we don't have what it takes to succeed or to flourish in the world. Oh, y'all don't hear what I'm saying. They've built a world in such a way that it causes you and me to doubt ourselves, to doubt your steps. But Baldwin put it this way: the details and symbols of your life have been deliberately constructed to make you believe what white people say about you. Please try to remember, he's saying this to his young nephew, and I'm saying it to men of color broadly. Please try to remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause you to endure, does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear. This is Baldwin in 1962. Please remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause you to endure, does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear, end quote. We are made to endure, as Baldwin suggests here, this country's refusal to confront who we actually are. That's what the critique of critical race theory is right now. It is this refusal to confront the ugliness of who we are. To admit that we are all trapped in a history that we refuse to know but carry within ourselves. This, as Baldwin says, is the American situation in relief, the root of our unadmitted sorrow. We live in a country that refuses to grow up. That's what adolescents do. The terrors and panic we experience today have everything to do with the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who deep down we really are. And the nation actively evades confronting this gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who we actually are. It locks us into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to an American myth as some kind of new world Eden refuse to grow up. Imagine being stuck, as I say over and over again across the country. Imagine being stuck in Never Never Land. What's distinctive about Peter Pan's Never Never Land? The lost boys and lost girls refuse to grow up. They don't want to be responsible. They don't want to be held to account. That's the state of the nation at large. And here Baldwin brings Ralph Waldo Emerson across the railroad tracks. I'm from the South, that's what we mean, from one side of town to the other. Baldwin grabs Ralph Waldo Emerson by the collar and snatches him across the proverbial railroad tracks, and he teaches him a lesson. And down at the cross, Baldwin writes, quote, "The person who distrusts himself," listen, "the person who distrusts himself has no touchstone for reality. For this touchstone can only be oneself. Such a person interposes between himself and reality nothing less than a labyrinth of attitudes. And these attitudes, furthermore, though the person is usually unaware of it, are historical and public attitudes. They do not relate to the present any more than they relate to the person. Therefore, whatever white people do not know about Negroes reveals precisely what they do not know about themselves. End quote. Oh, y'all got me in here trying to preach. I'm not a preacher. I'm a professor. Although, I'm gonna still mess with Sister Heather. I hope I'm not boring right now. That what they say about us, what they don't know about us, is actually a revelation about what they don't know about themselves. Part of refusing to believe what this country says about us, and I'm talking about men of color generally, part of what it means to refuse to believe what this country says about us involves understanding the particular nature of the panic at the root of this place. That the problem isn't us, never has been us. It has always been this view that some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than us. Baldwin says he never was the N-word. I've never been the N-word. I've never thought of myself as the N-word. The question is, why did you need the N-word in the first damn place? Why do you need the illegal immigrant in the first damn place? Why do you need the terrorist in the first damn place? Why do you need the designated other in the first place in order to confirm your own identity, America? And I say this not to slip into some easy kind of inversion. That is just another trap that will imprison you. I'm not trying to embrace some easy notion of identity, right? That's not the point here. This white world, this world predicated upon the belief that some people ought to matter more than others, is an invention aimed at trying to evade a genuine confrontation with the despair and panic at the heart of it all. And you and I have to figure out how to survive all of this, how to flourish in all of this. We've been given a tradition that is a grand inheritance. I come from Mississippi, that dark and beautiful place that gave us all of these extraordinary artists, from Richard Wright to Eudora Welty, to William Faulkner, all of these blues voices that give us the soundtrack of the country, having everything to do with blood-soaked soil, having everything to do with how does one imagine hope in this moment. I'm coming to a close. I'm bringing it home, right? Baldwin put it this way: for here you were, Big James, named for me. You were a big baby. I love that line. You were a big baby. I was not here. You were to be loved, baby, hard, at once and forever, to strengthen you against the loveless world. Remember that. I know how bleak it looks today for you. It looked bad that day too. And yes, we were trembling. We have not stopped trembling yet. But if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. And now you must survive because we love you and for the sake of your children and your children's children, end quote. That love, along with self-trust, Dr. Travis, that love, along with self-trust, stand as the key to flourishing, to be willing to open yourselves to a kind of critical questioning of the world as it is, to claim the world's library as your own, to be brash enough to imagine yourselves in the grandest of terms. That isn't talk of success. That is a bourgeois notion that will lead you to believe that material toys are the source of meaning. Instead, this is talk of flourishing. To live that Socratic dictum that the unexamined life is not worth living, to engage in the arduous task of self-creation, no matter what this damn world says about you and yours, to leave the fantasies and comforting illusions behind. In the essay entitled The Uses of the Blues, published in 1964, I only have 2 more pages. Y'all don't believe me. Y'all don't believe me. We're going to have a lot of time to talk. In the essay entitled The Uses of the Blues, published in 1964, Baldwin described what many call the Negro problem, and it takes us to the heart of the matter. quote, I'm talking about what happens to you if, having barely escaped suicide or death or madness or yourself, you watch your children growing up, and no matter what you do, you are powerless. You are really powerless against the forces of the world that is out to tell your child that he has no right to be alive.
I heard you on the window. Did you need me? What? I heard you.
And no amount of liberal jargon and no amount of talk about how well and how far we have progressed does anything to soften or to point out any solution to this dilemma. In every generation, Baldwin writes, ever since Negroes have been here, every Negro mother and father has had to face that child and try to create in that child some way of surviving this particular world, some way to make that child who will be despised not despise himself. End quote. Beyond the requirements of discipline and imagination, beyond the virtue of courage and a willingness to risk yourself in the pursuit of a better self, to flourish in the classroom as a man of color is to believe, no matter what is said about you, that a crown has been placed above your head and you must grow into it. This world conspires to make you small. And the question is whether you will be complicit. The question is whether you will be complicit. Stop quieting yourself. And that is not just limited to Black men and men of color. Stop muting yourself. Bring your full self into the room. That's the only way we're going to change this society. It takes two to dance. That's the only way we're going to change. Bring your full selves into the room. That doesn't mean you have to be the angry Black man or the angry Latinx person. You can bring your full self with love. A lot has gone into bringing you to this moment right here. Do what John Coltrane did. If the world conspires to make you small, and the question is whether you're going to be complicit or not, do what Coltrane did in Giant Steps. If you ever listen to that track, Giant Steps, his introductory solo is so complex, it's so something that the pianist had never heard before in his life, that the only thing the pianist could do is just tap the keys. He didn't know what to do. If the world conspires to make you small, take giant steps and flummox the world. Become the kind of human beings that will help transform what often feels like a God-forsaken world. We don't have to draw Bell's conclusion, but we must understand his insight. This country is what it is. And if we are ever to get out of history's ass pocket, it's going to require much more of us. Much more of you and me, much more of those brothers and sisters who identify as white, much more of all of us who are committed to a more just world. Sometimes people feel uncomfortable when I talk this way, but the idea is that it doesn't matter what color you are, what I'm saying matters to you. Take giant steps in a world that tries to make all of us small. And it begins, and I come to a close as any preacher would do, and I'm going to come to a close for real this time. All of this begins with an honest understanding of what the world is. But it does not end there. It begins with fashioning a self that rejects the terms that have been set for your lives. Baldwin says, when we step outside of the orbit of the world's expectations of us, when we step outside of the orbit of the world's expectation of us, we're talking revolution. We're talking revolution. Remember Bell's words. Acknowledging the persistence of racism is not a sign of submission, but an act of ultimate defiance. Flourish, fly, and go on out the yard. All right.